You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, how did Dr. J go from being cool to square? Before we get to the show, I want to tell you guys about Fast Break Breakfast. It's a fellow Harvard Paroxysm Network podcast. If you watch League Pass every night but aren't listening to Fast Break Breakfast, you are missing out. It's what happens when you get two musicians and a comic who are overeducated, underemployed, but share an obsession about the NBA, 90s movies, and conspiracy theories. So make sure you subscribe to Fast Break Breakfast, a podcast for serious NBA fans that is incredibly not serious. Welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason, and with me again is the great Curtis Harris of ProHoopsHistory.com. Curtis, welcome back to the show.
Always good to be back.
And we are going to talk about the one and only Julius Erving and his evolution and the team's evolution from being this incredibly cool, trend-setting, awesome dunk, this legend of the ABA that's obscured because they're not on television, but this guy who's, still being told mostly through word of mouth to becoming the NBA establishment by the early 80s and reaching a great team success with his teams but somewhat doing it on a blend of his own terms and also with what, the sort of this merging of the ABA's ideals, but with the NBA establishment as well.
Yeah, I guess we could say Dr. J, as we talk about him, he could be seen as like the good guy. I can't remember what the right literary term, but it's going to be like the allegory, the metaphor, whatever, of the NBA's like consumption of the ABA and, commodifying it, not commercializing it, but turning it completely for its own uses. So, the renegade ABA becomes, the business model of the conservative NBA by the end of the 80s. So Dr. J is the vehicle to tell that story, I guess.
Yeah, I that's a good way of putting it. There's a quote from Mark Jacobson wrote a piece in Esquire in February of '85, and there's a quote from Dr. J just talking about like how he's had an effect on the game, and it's part of a longer piece of just the things that he has done to affect the style of the game. But the most important thing he said was to make this kind of basketball a winning kind of basketball, taking into account a degree of showmanship that gets people excited. My overall goal is to give people the feeling that they are being entertained by an artist and to win. Then he laughs and says, the playground game, refined, which I think is a sort of a good way of defining kind of where he helped develop the game, first through his years in the ABA and then, of course, later on in the NBA. So, I think the things that made him this really the 70s icon of cool, of this, first and foremost, his, incredible trend-setting dunks, the ones that have been seen, but the many more that have been told through legend that, are unseen because they were unrecorded. Only the people there, can say exactly what he does. But all these descriptions of these incredible, fabulous moves, whether they're dunks or whether they're, these twisting layups around backboards or around, three players, that kind of thing. And just the obscurity of his legend in the ABA in general, just, it adds to it. I mean, he has this great image. He's this handsome guy. He, has the wonderful looking afro and, the wonderful 70s clothes. But, even more so are just the, what we don't see is almost better than what we do see.
Yeah. I mean, taking it way back to the beginning, like, it's just like this legend of Dr. J. Like, who is this Julius Erving? Like, when he went to UMass, people basically just got him up there like, who's this Julius Erving? They're like, oh, my God, this guy can really play. And then when he goes to the Virginia Squires, the coaches there was like, hey, he can't be as good as people said he was. They're like, oh, my God, he's better than they said he was. Like, just when you look at his stats, like when I bring up his stats on, Twitter or whatever, I'm mentioning it, it's like, y'all realize Dr. J averaged like 27 and 16 his rookie year in ABA. And it's just like, there's hardly any video of him with the Virginia Squires his rookie year. So, like, you just have to imagine, like, what is it like for this, like, scrawny small forward who could jump out the gym to get 27 points and 16 rebounds a game? And then as time goes on, we start to get more film of him, and then we get acclimated. We see the great moves, but then as you've said it so well, it's eventually like, the the man, the myth, or, the myth, the legend slowly becomes the man. And like by the end of it, we know exactly what he is, and we've seen it all, and it's every little bit of it is recorded. So I think it's kind of fitting that he began in this era where hardly any games were recorded. Then by the end of it, it's all recorded for all intents and purposes. We see every single one of his moves, but as good as they were, like 1984 and 1986, is the stuff like 72 and 76 that really get people's imagination, because we don't know exactly what was going on there because we don't have the film to see exactly what kind of moves he was pulling off every night.
Yeah, and there's a couple of great photos of him that sort of tell the tale, and there's one of him at his first Philadelphia 76ers press conference, and he still has the afro. He has this he has this gray jacket on underneath it, and then he has this big collared like patterned shirt with all this like brown and orange and gray, and is just is just totally looking like he's still like a young man. Another one that's a publicity photo with him and Michael Jordan, and he's wearing this he's wearing sort of this like tan sport coat, very 80s, this skinny brown tie, and he has one finger on the basketball, and Jordan has his other finger on the Michael Jordan is in the photo, and he has his other finger on the basketball, and it's just a very like this. It's very much your dad. In the second photo, he definitely became your dad by the by the mid 80s, which that was his age, so that's perfectly understandable, but. It's very funny to obviously we all get older, we all change, but it is very, these two images are a very stark contrast.
It very much is. It is like in the ABA, like the photos we do have in the ABA, we've seen it. He has the big giant blowout afro, and then even by 78, his like second year in the NBA, the afro's already starting to get cut down. You're just like, oh man. And then by 81 and 82, it's not even an afro anymore. He just has like, his hair is just not buzz cut anymore. It's just like he has a nice little head of hair. And then by 86 and 87, you start to see the salt and pepper look starting to come in. It's just like, oh man, Dr. J's turned into our dad. It's just, he was still getting up and making these dunks, but it's like, he just looks like a dad off the court. And like the 80s didn't help. They had like those big giant telescope glasses. So
yeah,
it's like, Doc.
Yeah.
Doc, he went from like the fur coats in 75, like the big giant glasses in 86. It was just like, man.
Yeah. I feel like he was wearing those sweaters too. He's wearing those 80s those sweaters.
Yeah, the Cosby sweaters.
Yeah. I think didn't we decide to call them Bill Russell sweaters?
Oh, you did? I'm sorry. Yeah.
I thought you did actually, but
I don't know, but whoever said that we shouldn't call it Cosby sweaters anymore, he wore conservative 80s sweaters.
Yes, exactly. So colorful conservative 80s sweaters. So and this we're all multifaceted, but his personality also was he talked about in his autobiography just loving structure and order. He needed things to be neat. He was not really a guy who was involved in politics or the Black Power movement in the 70s. He was more of a guy who just wanted just to accommodate people and be on his team. I mean, he was a he did believe in those ideals, but he wasn't necessarily a guy who did much participating in it. He was also very much, very team oriented, went out of his way to blend in with a team and listen to his coach, even sometimes to the possible detriment of his team. Also very serious off the court, not into drugs and partying, and focused a lot, especially in the 80s, on making money, establishing his businesses, what we would call today his brand. And, once the ABA merged with the NBA, he obviously became part of that establishment, and through the 70s and into the 80s, his look became more part of the establishment. Although you can certainly argue the establishment came closer to him, and looking at what the NBA was in 77 versus 84, contrasting the 76 dunk contest, which is kind of the last great famous moment of the ABA, and then he's in the finals. keying a 20-point comeback in Game 6 of the finals to lead his team, the Nets, beating the Rockets in that, or the Nuggets in that finals. Contrasting the 76, his final moments there, the dunk contest with the 84 dunk contest, it's very much an NBA event and very much what was going on in the NBA at the time, but it's still the NBA co-opting the spirit of the ABA for that dunk contest, and Dr. J reprising his famous free throw line dunk and doing a pretty good job of pulling off that dunk eight years later, even though he's in his early 30s at that point.
Yeah, no, he did do the dunk. It was legit.
Yeah, yeah. And it still looked graceful and still looked, like an incredible thing to see even today. It's even empowering even today, even with all the dunks that we've seen and all, the increased athleticism in the league and, 30 plus years since this. It's still a great thing to see.
Yeah. He was 33 years old dunking from the free throw line.
Yeah.
So, definitely nothing to sneeze at, but, I think you were hitting a lot of nails on the head there. Like the NBA, co-opting a lot of the ABA spirit. So, going back to the late 60s, early 70s, the NBA was just like, oh, the NBA is a gimmick. They got that red, white, and blue ball, the 3-point line. They don't play any defense and yada, yada, yada. And they're undermining the whole financial structure of pro basketball, just like giving high schoolers and, 1-year college players contracts. And then, by the mid-'80s, the NBA is copying all of it. They got the 3-point line in the NBA, 3-point contest, the dunk contest. So I think it's a great story showing of how, you can fear or, denigrate like these new ideas or these, just new ideas. But then you soon start trying to figure out, well, if people do like the idea, how can we actually take advantage of it, like kind of harness it? I think that's a good phrase to use. Like, how do we harness what this new thing is? Because we're a little afraid of it, but people are intrigued by it. So we got to harness it and use it for our own purposes. And Dr. J, as we talked about, he's still, dunking from the free throw line in his 30s, but you could see like his style of play, had moved, I guess, the NBA center a little bit more towards his style of play, but you could also see how definitely his style of play was harnessed by the NBA toward, I guess you could say, like a higher purpose from their regard, of expanding the game's reach and making it more commercial and more popular with the fans. And Dr. J was a good vehicle for that, too, because as you were saying, he was a guy that, deferred to the coach, accommodated teammates, didn't dabble into cocaine and all that stuff that was really giving the NBA an image problem back then. Whereas a guy like David Thompson, who was every bit as exciting as Julius Erving, he did succumb to the cocaine problems like many other players did. So Julius was a success story in that regard. And that's why I think he stands out as like the premier ABA player. Was the fact that, he did survive and have a lengthy career in the NBA and, didn't push back too hard against being co-opted by the NBA, I would say, in some regards.
Yeah, and he definitely straddled those two worlds of of this being this great artist and being this, incredible transcendent force while also being this being the businessman and being the guy who just who went along and kind of went with the trends of the league and made his way in that world and made his way with a new team in a new league and played the game, so to speak. Yeah,
and something else that I just remember. It's like I watched an old interview of Dr. J, and this is from like 1974 or 75. And he was talking about one of his, I think it was his high school coach at the time. And his high school coach was, Julius in 75 was recalling his high school coach. So I guess it's like in the late 60s, telling him, Julius, if you want to, what do you want in your life? And Julius was like, I want to be successful. And the coach said, well, if you want to be successful, you got to, this is America. And people who work hard and, hone their talent, we have a system that allows people like that to be successful. And so even though Julius had this outlandish talent that, very few people have, this very creative talent, he still viewed that the way to make the most of that talent was to go through the established, as best as he could, the established route of America, which was, the old idea of, working hard, making the most of your talent, not obeying, but, deferring to, the authority in the situation because, that will eventually get you a step up. So maybe one day you become the authority, that your example is the one that people follow in the future. So, he's a curious mix of being like, a little bit of a renegade, but more so a deferential character.
Yes.
To get ahead. And that's not trying to say any of that like in a bad way necessarily, but it is just the way that he was. That's how he viewed it. Like, that's what he said in that interview in 75. Like, this is what I was told and this is what I followed. He's like, the success he had at that point, he attributed to following the guidelines set out by his high school coach.
Yeah, and as much of a renegade that he was not interested in challenging authority. That was one thing he did not want to do. And he one thing is that he was not like, he was a very good high school player, but he was not heavily recruited. He didn't really grow into the player that he would become until he was in college, and so he didn't have the same sort. A lot of players had been fawned over for since they were fairly young. He didn't necessarily have that. He was a bit of a late bloomer as a player, so that probably helped him have a little bit more perspective than other guys might have had in that situation. So he debuts with the Sixers in actually a day before. He joins the team a day before the season opener. Yep. He had a holdout with the Nets before then, trying to renegotiate his contract. The Nets, as the other ABA teams had just joined the ABA, they all had to pay a significant amount of money to get into the league, and the Nets had to pay a bunch of extra money to because they were in the same territory as the Knicks.
Yeah, even though the Nets have been around since 68, they're like, no, you're quote unquote a new franchise invading their territory, so you got to pay like $1 million penalty.
Right,
so.
And they'd also acquired Tiny Archibald, and and paying him a significant contract as well. So they couldn't keep Erving as well, especially for the money that he was going to be due with a new contract. So ended up negotiating with the Sixers, who had his ABA rival George McGinnis there, making sure that he's okay with it. Eventually, they do make the deal, even though it hurts him to leave the Nets, who he had won 2 championships with in the previous 3 seasons, but the Sixers are a very good team at that point. They had gone from 9-73 3 years before that to a 46-win team behind but McGinnis, also Doug Collins, Steve Mix, and Billy Cunningham, who was just about to retire. And so this was a team on the rise. And in 77, they were a 50-win team, which was tied for second in the league. This is the time in which a lot of parity, where the high records are not very high and the low records are not very low. And we're third in the league in SRS.
Yeah, and of course, that 77 team, has the famous or infamous finals against the Blazers. And we have mentioned this before about just all of the coded language that went into that final series. It's a doozy. But that Sixers team kind of set the template for what the late 76ers would be. It was where they would have this really, really good team that lost a nail biter in the playoffs. So the 77 squad, as I said, they go against the Blazers. They take a 2-0 series lead, and then they lose the next 4 games, even though Julius had a just absolutely fantastic, monstrous series. It is one of the overlooked NBA Finals performances. So great individual performance on his behalf, but the rest of the team really let him down, I would say, in that series. But Julius being Julius, I don't think he would ever say publicly, like, the rest of the team let me down. Like, that just wouldn't be his style. But I would say the rest of the teammates did let him down, whereas the Blazers were just, well-oiled machine. Everybody pulled their weight that they were supposed to pull, and they came out on top in that series.
Yeah, and Erving in that series had 30.3 points, 6.8 rebounds, 5 assists, 2.7 steals, and 1.2 blocks and shot 54% from the field. So excellent numbers there. McGinnis really stood out as he shot 38% from the field, 13 points, 9.3 rebounds. And was known for a high turnover player as well. The turnovers that aren't in this box score, but I would imagine that they were high. The
very next season they finally began recording turnovers, and McGinnis was turning them over like hotcakes.
That's right. Yeah. So. So there was sort of a mix of his adjustment to the team was a little bit tough. Gene Shu had it was intended to be they had a lot of guys who needed to eat, so to speak. I mean, they had a lot of gunners, World Be Free, Joe Bryant, McGinnis, even Collins, who was had been a number one overall draft pick, was talented shooting guard, had a lot of foot problems, so injuries kind of kept him from reaching his potential. But a lot of guys who needed the ball. So the idea was more for him to sort of fit in rather than the team to sort of be centered around him. And they had so much talent that there was some justification for maybe thinking that way. And he later referred to this as the team that won't shut up. Just a lot of a mix of interesting personalities and a lot of guys who were talented but may have been not necessarily out for themselves, because they did have pretty good camaraderie. But
it's just not the work. It's like, just people you get along with in terms of socializing, and then there's people you get along with in terms of working. And, in the NBA sense, this is work for them. So if your personalities and demeanors don't work on the court, then, well, you're not going to be as successful as you can be. So, maybe they get along. Nobody hated each other necessarily, but, in terms of a basketball sense, their personalities didn't fit quite well. Neither did their games. It was an awkward pairing, and that's what happens, when you just two leagues merge and players are going every which way. You're just going to get some awkward fits at that point.
Sure. And, one series that isn't talked about but I think is sort of interesting in a story narrative idea is the East semis. They beat the Celtics 4-3. That was the year after the Celtics had won the championship. They still had JoJo White. Havlicek was, I think, 37 at that point, so he's getting near the end of his career. He'd have one more season. And they had Cowens, Charlie Scott. They'd also added Sidney Wicks. Speaking of chemistry issues,
Yep.
But they dethroned the establishment of the old guard, the Boston Celtics. The team that Red Auerbach, who hated the ABA, wanted nothing to do with the ABA, denigrated it as often as he could. They were the team that this team of playground chuckers beat the vaunted Boston Celtics. Just sort of interesting story. I guess this gets obscured in the other Boston versus Philly legend, but I find it interesting that not really talked about in terms of this rivalry.
Yeah, but it's late 70s NBA. Nothing happened except the Bill Walton Blazers at that point. So
there you go. And they also went through Houston in that series, who had Calvin Murphy, Ruud Tomjanovich, a very young Moses Malone, and John Lucas, who had been a number one overall draft pick. And actually, the end of the series was a controversial charging call in Game 6. Lucas was called for an offensive foul on Doug Collins. This was in Houston, a situation where if the refs were going to lean one way, they would normally lean toward the home team, but the road team got it, and they were able to win that series. But that sort of was the end of, not the end, but a very promising Houston team ended up being scuttled the next year with the Ruud Tomjanovich fight, and later losing John Lucas, because they acquired Rick Barry. So
not a great trade.
Right. So moving on to 78, they're still a strong regular season team, 55 wins, second in the league in SRS. Pretty much the same team, except for Billy Cunningham becomes the coach 6 games in the season. Shue is fired, and Cunningham, Shue was more of we need to rely on the playbook, and we need to kind of rely on our plan, where Cunningham was more of an emotional character and was more, Erving said in his book that he more adjusted to the game rather than just kind of doggedly sticking toward a game plan. Also, they had Chuck Daly as the assistant. Of course, we all know what a brilliant coach Chuck Daly would end up being later on with the Pistons.
Yeah, now you kind of got it right with the description of the head of coaches. Cunningham, as you said, adjusts to the game. He sees what's happening. He tries to tailor himself to the situation. Whereas Gene Shue was like, I know what we need to do. The game's not going right. We just need to try to fit the game into what we need to do. Trying to fit the round peg into the square hole. And the team did get off to a really bit of a rough start with Gene Shue, and then Cunningham comes in, and I think I've read in some places where Cunningham was kind of basically just lobbying for the job and undermining Gene Shue. So
I know Gene Shue.
That didn't play too well looking back on it, but Cunningham did take them to higher success, eventually. But the first year, you really can't say it was a better success than having Gene Shue as coaches. They lost a round earlier. But still in heartbreaking fashion, as was typical in the late 70s for the 76ers.
Yeah, they after sweeping the Knicks in the semis with Bob McAdoo, Spencer Haywood, Jim McMillan as well. I know one of your favorites, Earl Monroe, kind of at the end there. Then they were upset by a 44-win Bullets team that would later win the finals in the Eastern Conference Finals. They had Elvin Hayes, Bob Dandridge, Kevin Greavy, Wes Unseld still with the team, although he actually missed 3 games of that series, presumably with injury. But yeah, they lost that final game in heartbreaking fashion, 101 to 99. Anything specific about that series that you recall that stands out?
No. Unfortunately, I've never been able to see any film of the series. Like, I would love to get my hands on it, but yeah. But yeah, no, it's just in the scheme of things, it's like, well, here's the vaunted Sixers with all that talent, and then they get upset once again, taken down by a team or by a franchise that has seemed to be more of a team, players that play better together. Like, Unseld missed half that series, but, in the wider scheme of things, Unseld, Hayes, Dandridge, Greavy, you mentioned, Mitch Kupchak, Greg Ballard. These were guys, you had a couple of star players, but you had a lot of guys that kind of fit into their roles, and they knew their roles, and they played to their roles, whereas the Sixers still had all those voices going on, so to speak. So you still had McGinnis and Dr. J with that awkward fit, where I think by this point they realized, like, yeah, this just the two just don't work well, because not that they didn't like each other, but it's just that McGinnis for some reason had this weird complex, like not an inferiority complex, but like an idea that if he wasn't the unqualified go-to person on offense, then he had a hard time, being effective on offense. And if Julius Erving is there, he's clearly the better all-around player by that point. McGinnis kind of just shrank into the background. It really didn't assert himself. Then of course that offseason comes a big trade that really rejuvenates the 76ers in the long run.
Yeah, and one thing that Ervin said about McGinnis, playing with McGinnis, is that it forced him to play away from the basket a lot more, and he wasn't able to shoot as effectively from the field because of that. And his numbers were down quite a bit in his first a decent amount in his first 3 years in the league before eventually in 80 he breaks through and then wins the MVP in 81. I mean, he was still an effective player, but wasn't quite. Yeah. It was definitely a step down from his ABA days. 79, as you mentioned, the trade. McGinnis is traded for Bobby Jones. I know one of your favorite players.
Absolutely one of my favorite players. Love Bobby Jones.
Yeah. And Jones had battled with Erving in the 76 finals. Had tried to defend Erving, although Erving was awesome in that finals. And Warby Free was traded to the Clippers, and Maurice Cheeks was drafted as well. And these were moves that sort of started to change the tenor of the team. They definitely dropped in the regular season this year, 47 and 35 in the season, tied for 6th in the league with 3 other teams for that record, and then 9th in the league in SRS. So down in the regular season, and had similar playoff success, but obviously better times were coming with the with this new crew.
Yeah, and I think what we see here is the team transitioning from this hodgepodge. Let's put it this way: in '76, or for the '77 season, the team didn't foresee that the ABA was going to collapse and that the leagues were going to merge and they're going to have access to all this talent. So the team they had been building before that was kind of going toward a different destination. And then all of a sudden, Julius Erving falls in their lap literally, like you said, the day before the 77 season starts. So, yeah, they had that success, but the team they had wasn't necessarily constructed to work together. They just kind of fell into it. Whereas with the 79 team, they finally decided, okay, Julius is going to be the man. What kind of team can we build around him that's going to maximize his talent and have the players around him be maximized? So you see them getting rid of George McGinnis, who was, a more creative offensive player than Bobby Jones. But Bobby Jones, whatever shots he took, he was going to make. And he's not a guy that needed the ball in his hands to be effective on offense or to feel effective on offense. And, of course, was a much better defensive player than George McGinnis. And then, as you say, drafting Maurice Cheeks. There's a point guard that's going to play dead, a hard-nosed defense, was going to be able to distribute the ball and didn't need a shot either, but could make a shot if he was given the opportunity. So this kind of gave Julius and Doug Collins, they were the guys that were going to score the ball on offense. Everybody else was going to kind of fill in the roles properly. Still had the knucklehead in Darryl Dawkins, but for the most part, the team is starting to feel more like Julius's team, a team that's going to flow around him better. So still had that heartbreaking loss in this playoff series against the San Antonio Spurs. Although the Spurs almost blew this one too, though. They were up 3-1, and they blew it almost to the 76ers.
Yeah.
And then they did it in the next round. They blew another 3-1 series lead and actually lost it to the Bullets in the conference finals.
Right. And that Spurs team, had Gervin, Larry Kennan, Billy Pulitz, and Mike Gale, who all had previously been Doc's teammates.
Yes.
James Silas as well on the team. The only one of those. Those are basically, 5 of their main players on that team all had been, 4 of them had been teammates with him. So I thought that was interesting. They also beat the Nets in the first round, of course, Doc's former team, with Super John Williamson really being the last key net from Doc's days being on that team. So, 2 years later, that team is almost completely broken up. And
just one other thing about that, looking at the Spurs and the 76ers rosters, you see the effect the ABA had, because, the Spurs are an ABA team that had joined the NBA. And all the players you mentioned, Gervin, Keenan, Silas, Gale, Pultz, those were, 5 of the 6 main players of the Spurs, and they were all people that came out of the ABA. And then they had Louis Dampier on the bench still at that point, although Dampier was at the end of his career. But you can see at that point, the Spurs were one of the premier teams in the NBA, and they were stocked with all ABA talent. So you see, the NBA is, they've harnessed it. Their best teams are now teams that are stacked with the old ABA talent at this point.
So moving on to the 1980 season, the bounce back, 59 wins, 3rd in the league. They have the 4th best SRS in the league. They bring back a lot of guys, but obviously Maurice Cheeks is coming into his own in his second season and was not afraid to throw the ball to Doc, even with Billy Cunningham told him we're going to play. He would ask, why are you throwing a Doc? And then Cheeks' response was just because he asked me to. So he definitely knew where his bread was buttered, and really became one of the better point guards of the 80s. I mean, isn't really held necessarily in that high of esteem, but really, you look at his numbers in the 80s, and of course, the performance of the Sixers for most of that decade, and it's really good stuff. So they added Clint Richardson to the team as well, and they traded for their big acquisition probably was their midseason trade for Lionel Hollins from the Blazers, after they had gone after Pete Maravich, who had been finally cut by the Jazz, but Maravich decided to go with the Celtics instead.
Yeah. Better choice to go after Lionel Hollins at that point in the players' respective careers, but not that Hollins lasted much longer either, unfortunately, because of injury, but a better fit for what they were looking for at that point. And Clint Richardson, an unheralded guy, he's a little bit like Mo Cheeks, where he's one of those players that on offense didn't need the ball in his hands, but played, pressure defense on the ball. And he would come up big in the 83 season when they finally won a championship. So you see them adding these little players, stocking the bench with the right kind of guys, quote unquote, the right kind of guys to play with Julius Erving. And yeah, as you mentioned, the team took a huge leap forward in 1980. I guess it just felt like Julius, finally had the right kind of team around him in the NBA finally after 3 years of waiting. And his scoring average jumped up considerably, was named the MVP of the season, of the NBA that season. And they really tore through the playoffs until they got to the finals against the Lakers. And, when you go against Kareem and Magic, you're going to have some trouble. But they tore apart the Eastern Conference up until that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they ran through the Bullets in the first round 2-0 in the mini-series. Hayes and Unseld, but were, of course, still there, but they were aging, and I think Hayes was just about out. They lost
and Dandridge was hurt that year, too.
Okay, and they had lost Kupchak to the Lakers as well, so we're a thinner team. Then they beat the Hawks in the semis 4-1, who had Dan Roundfield, John Drew, Fast Eddie Johnson, not the Eddie Johnson for the Suns, but the other Eddie Johnson who got in serious legal trouble.
Yes, the convicted Eddie Johnson.
Yes, there you go. And True Rollins as well. And then they beat the Celtics, who were the other emerging team of 1980. 4-1 in surprisingly, reasonably easy fashion in the Eastern Conference Finals. They had won 61 games and had the best SRS in the league. Of course, Larry Bird's rookie year, they still had Dave Cowens, who was about at the end there. Cornbread Maxwell, Tiny Archibald, who they had picked up, and Pete Maravich, who was coming off the bench. I guess from what I've read, they really relied maybe a little bit too much on Bird in that series and just didn't spread things out with the system. But the Sixers obviously were a strong team as well, and were able to restart a great rivalry that would last through most of the rest of the particularly the early part of the 80s.
Yep. Yeah, rivalry that really went through like 85 and 86. So it was a pretty tough one. Right, almost. The Sixers were much better than we remember. Like we think of the 80s as the Lakers and Celtics, but forget the first half of the decade. The Sixers were when you actually look at the records and stuff, they were not by a lot, but they were the dominant team in the East during the first half of the 80s. But, sure, yeah. But anyways, that's what we're talking about, how dominant they were. So.
So the Lakers they would lose to the Lakers. Of course, the other big story of that season, Magic Johnson as a rookie, leading the Lakers to the finals in the championship, and famously, Game 6 he would have a transcendent performance for the ages in leading them to a championship without Kareem in that game. Jamal Wilkes also scoring 37 in that game to beat the Sixers that year. So 81, they get even better. They're 62-20, tied for the best record in the league, very close to the same record as the Celtics and the Bucks that year. All powerhouses in the Eastern Conference. The Bucks had just moved to the Eastern Conference. Andrew Toney was added to the team in 81. It was kind of the other really key, young addition that added to the team. Kind of another, great draft that, Pat Williams did a really good job. The famous general manager who of building the team around Doc and keeping them a contender for the next half decade.
Yeah, and by this point, this is when Doug Collins' foot problems really, caused him basically to retire. So, yeah, they got Andrew Toney at the right time, like this young shooting guard to replace Doug Collins, who unfortunately should have been, just at the peak of his career. His career was actually coming to an end because of those foot problems. But the Sixers, as you said, they were right there with the Celtics and Bucks. And I think the poor Milwaukee Bucks. But they couldn't catch a break in the 80s. But the playoff series, the Sixers played the Bucks first. That series went 7 games, and the Sixers won by 1 point in Game 7. And then in the conference finals, the Sixers take the Celtics to 7 games, but they lost to the Celtics by 1 point. So that just shows you how close all three of those teams were that season, where you had 2 Game 7s between them, and they're decided by 2 points total. Basically, you're flipping a coin, and you have the Eastern Conference champion that season between those 3 teams.
Right, and and of course, one bad thing for the Sixers is that with the Celtics winning the series, blowing that 3-1 lead, they faced the Rockets in the finals, who were a much easier opponent for than the Lakers. The Lakers were a little down that year, but then the Lakers teams that the Sixers would always bump into. The Celtics did benefit from some luck in a lot of weirdness in the Western Conference playoffs that season. The Celtics fans tried to tip over the bus after the Game 7 loss, which of course the Sixers players appreciated. So and Erving, he in his autobiography, he said nice things about basically everyone, but the one group of people that he did not say nice things about were the Celtic fans.
Well, I mean, that's not surprising.
No.
That's if anybody's going to get on Julius's nerves, it will be Celtics fans. So,
yes. So
as nice and affable a man as he is, the Celtics fans would annoy him.
Yes. So 82, they are still very good, 58-24, second in the league in the record, also second in the league in SRS. Pretty similar team, really. Pretty almost exactly the same team. They buzzed through they beat the Bucks at 4-2, a little bit of an easier time beating them, although still a tough series. And then they beat the Celtics 4-3 in the Eastern Conference Finals, almost blowing another 3-1 lead, but pulling off a victory in Game 7. And after their Game 6 loss, Doc called a team meeting, and they tried to figure out, like, okay, what's going on? What can we do? And then Clint Richardson says, it's just us. And then they start sort of chanting, it's just us, like as a mantra for the team. Like, we're going to do this. It's just us. We believe in everything. We believe in ourselves and believing we can beat the world. And then the next day in the locker room, someone had taped up all these letters on the wall of fans who believed in the team and all these kind words of, we believe in you, we think you can do it. And that inspired the win even more than the other approach had, and led to the Sixers winning a Game 7 in Boston. And actually Boston fans chanting "Beat LA" to the Sixers in that game, which for the negatives he might have had, for Boston fans that was certainly a moment that he appreciated.
Oh yes, for that one moment they weren't assholes to him.
There you go.
They were assholes to LA. That's what. That one shining moment.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So it's interesting because, of course, the Celtics really had no reason to hate LA at that point, because they had beaten LA every time they'd ever faced each other in the playoffs. So there was
that's true.
That animosity that would come later when the Lakers started winning. Theoretically should not have been there, but whatever. But a similar result to the 80 finals, they would lose exactly the same number of games, 4 games to 2. The Lakers bolstered with the addition of Bob McAdoo.
Yeah, this one was a little unfair because the Sixers, their big problem was, obviously they rectified the problem in the offseason, but the big problem was still at center, where you still had Darryl Dawkins hold down the fort at center. And Caldwell Jones, by this point, had usurped him in playing time, but Caldwell, great defensive center, but shouldn't have been getting 30 minutes a game. Definitely a 20, 22 minute a game backup center. So Kareem was just feasting on them, and so was Bob McAdoo, as you mentioned. He was picked up, and God, I'm looking at the stats in front of me. The Lakers had 6 players averaged between 13 and 20 points a game that series. So they were just spreading the wealth and having no problem going through the Philly defense.
They definitely beat them pretty soundly inside. That was definitely the key to the series. And after the loss, Erving said that he cried in the locker room for the first time in his career. Saying there has to be a reason this keeps happening, because obviously he's been in the league now for 6 years and he has not been able to win a championship in the NBA. And there's a lot of pressure for him. There is this. They did have narratives back then, and there is definitely this belief that, okay, yeah, he won those championships in the ABA, but he hasn't won a championship in the real league yet. And he definitely, conceded to, being frustrated by that and feeling the pressure to, bring a championship to the team. Of course, he had a lot of personal pride as well, just wanted to win a championship for himself, but that was, definitely a factor in things as well.
And just to pause for this moment, you brought up a good point. Julius is very defensive of the ABA. Like, you look at his Twitter handle, or his Twitter description, excuse me. His Twitter description says, he's a 4-time MVP, 3-time champion. So in his mind, he doesn't view the ABA as inferior whatsoever to the NBA. Because obviously to do so for him would be to, devalue what he did as a player for the first 6 years of his career. And he sticks up for the other guys. So he sticks up for George Gervin, for James Silas, for Ron Boone, all those other guys that don't get as much attention as they should from their ABA playing days. So for him, he's very prideful of the ABA. Even though it was the renegade league, and we've been talking about how he himself wasn't much of a renegade, he still values the hard work that was put in by the players in the ABA. So maybe it was a different sort of league. Maybe it was a little rough and tumble. Maybe it was a renegade league. But he believes that the league, it seems to me that he believes the league was filled with guys who played hard, who worked hard, who contributed a lot, and their contribution shouldn't be diminished. So it's not the least bit surprising that, that narrative would annoy him in the early 80s. Where yeah, he's won 2 titles, but they weren't real titles. They were in the ABA. When's he going to do it in the real league? And sure enough, 83, they get Moses Malone and another ABA turned NBA star, and they barnstorm the league. They tear it apart.
Yeah, absolutely. They finished 65-17. Start 50-7. They were threatening to win 70, but they sort of slowed. They took the foot off the gas pedal in the last few weeks of the season and finished 15-10. But that did not hurt them at all in the playoffs. They the Moses' faux prediction or whatever you might consider it almost came true. They beat the Knicks in the East semifinals. Bernard King, Truck Robinson, and Paul Westphal team. Then they beat the Bucks 4-1 in the East Conference Finals. Their only loss in that series, and then. Storm through the Lakers. I do want to go back though, because I thought it was interesting about how Doc learned about the trades. First, it was a trade of Darryl Dawkins to the Nets, and he didn't know what the team was doing. He was in China, touring China at the time. ML Carr was there, who was a Celtics player who was basically coming off the bench, basically known for sort of waving the towel in the mid '80s. But he was a good player, in his day, and had started off in the ABA. So Moses would make fun of him of what have they turned you into? What have the Celtics turned you into? You're this towel waving guy, and they would kind of bust each other, being old friends from the ABA. And then when the first trade went down, Carr's making fun of him. It's like, oh, you guys, there's no way you guys are going to win anymore. You just traded away, your only good big man. And then later, reasonably soon later, they would find out about Moses, and then he would say, hey, you guys just won the title. And Moses came in, and they were able to. I think he was able to work really well. Blend really well with Doc as far as he kind of made it didn't try to carve his own territory. I mean, he was Doc's our leader, but he put in exactly the right kind of work that filled all the gaps that the team needed while letting Erving do his thing. He's advanced in age at that point, but was still a very effective player, and they were able to blend together so well on the court and off the court as well.
Yeah, what they became with Moses was just a really fierce defensive team. I've gone back and watched those games. What strikes me is just the defensive intensity they brought, and then how that it's almost like an intimidation of the opponent. Because Moses Malone wasn't a one-on-one. He wasn't a great defender, but clearly he was like a monster on the board. So he would just wear guys out on the boards, and everybody else on the court was either a good or just absolutely legendary all-time defender between Julius and Maurice Cheeks and Bobby Jones and Clint Richardson. So they would just intimidate and wear out the other team on the court. So I think that's what Moses was able to bring to us, just this intimidation factor. And I don't mean that in the stupid macho sense, we're going to beat somebody's brains out, but just you see them warming up on the other end of the court, and you're just ah, shit, we got to play against these guys tonight. They're going to run us up and down the court. Moses is going to beat us on the boards. It's just not something you really get up for. It's facing that team. And they pulverized the Lakers in the finals, although the Lakers lost James Worthy to a leg injury, so that clearly didn't help them out. But the Sixers just beat them to shreds in the finals. They had a couple of close games, but the Sixers, I don't think it was ever in doubt that they were going to win that series. And yeah, Moses, I think, just provided the right amount of edge to that team where he wasn't going to step on Julius's toes. They both knew that the other was a superstar, but they just realized, all right, we each got to kind of our own turfs, but we know that we can work together. And Moses didn't come in and say this is my team now, and Julius didn't say, well, this is still my team. They just realized it's both of ours. The team is both of ours. We need each other to make this team a success. So I think that's why they succeeded as well as they did.
Yeah, and the Sixers, they stormed back from Lakers leads in games 1 and 2 and able to won both those games fairly handily. In previous situations, they would have. Erving talked about how they would have been felt rattled in a similar situation if they had been down to the Lakers, or a lot of times they would take big leads from the Lakers and then would whittle them away and then would lose their confidence. But this year, obviously, they had the talent to maintain that. Moses averaged 25.8, 18 in the finals, and Erving averaged 19 points, 8.5 rebounds, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, and 2.8 blocks on 47% shooting. So excellent series from him and from Moses as well, who won the MVP of the league and of the finals. And it's of course interesting that this is two great ABA players. I mean, Erving, obviously the most famous player from the ABA, and Moses, who began his career in the ABA and became a huge star. These two guys with a coach in Billy Cunningham, also a guy who had defected to the ABA. So these guys with these ABA ties, coming together and winning a championship, kind of the last gasp for that ABA era generation to be a dominant force in the league before the Bird Magic era would really take hold, and it would be the league would be dominated by those guys or guys who were of that age for the up until Jordan took over in the early 90s.
I mean, it's passing on the guard, it clearly happens all the time. It's the cyclical nature of the league. But yeah, it's you got it. It's the culmination of like the ABA's, I guess, infection is the word I'm thinking of. Like the infection of the NBA by the ABA. The MVP, the Finals MVP, the league championship. I think Billy Cunningham was the coach of the year too that season. Like all these guys with these ABA ties. That was the first year they had the Sixth Man Award, and Bobby Jones won it. He was another ABA guy that came out of there. So. This is really like, I guess, the coronation of like the ABA success and like really influencing the NBA was the 83 season with the Sixers. And on top of that, when you look at Bird and Magic and the way those teams played, the Celtics and Lakers, it was very much an ABA style because, Larry Bird was this 6'8 forward, 6'8", 6'9 forward who was taking three-pointers. Like, what the hell is this about? Like, that's clearly something that you could say it's like a strain of the ABA. Then Magic, this 6'9" point guard, just razzle and dazzle with the passes. Like that's something else that's from the ABA spirit. So by that point, even the players who hadn't played in the ABA were in a way influenced by the freewheeling nature of the ABA that had like just trickled down through all of basketball and had, if not directly influenced those players, just by the ABA existing, it had allowed that kind of play to be acceptable across the board, so to speak, in professional basketball.
Yeah. And looking back at that 84 dunk contest, one thing that stands out to me when he famously reprises that free throw line dunk and hits it successfully is you can really see how giddy Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas are watching from the baseline. Kind of taken back to, as I'm sure they looked up to Erving, even if they weren't able to see him much. Looked up to him as a player and the idea of him, and I'm sure certainly he was a hero. I'm sure he was a hero to them. I mean, Magic when he was when he was drafted before his rookie season actually came to stay with Erving, and Erving kind of showed him the ropes of the league and gave him some advice about how to handle things and such. So to see the effect that he had on those guys and that generation of players who really brought the league into the whole game into a greater amount of success and a greater amount of esteem and fame and all that good stuff, and brought the business of basketball to a whole nother level. It's interesting, of course, how these things stack upon one another.
Yeah, and another thing to add on to it is just like earlier I mentioned, like Julius is so defensive of the ABA and like just talks about these guys that don't get enough attention. Along those lines, Moses Malone was someone who epitomized kind of some of the unsung nature of the ABA, where I just mentioned also, like Bird shooting threes and Magic being the 6'9" point guard was like just transmogrification of the NBA by the ABA. But then you had Moses Malone, this other guy from the ABA, who was just the most pale-male, workman-like player you can imagine. There's another guy that came out of the ABA. So the ABA was able to influence the NBA in a number of ways where he had like the greatest offensive rebounder in basketball history came from this league that was noted for like just the freewheeling nature of its perimeter players. So just the ABA giving the NBA just all kinds of sustenance and, just things to market in the 80s. The NBA just benefited so much from what the ABA provided. Really. And this is, of course, 40 years after the leagues merged this year. So the influence is still there. It's still palpable in a number of ways. Kool in the Gang is a good analogy for Dr. J.
Okay.
Because Kool in the Gang was really awesome in the 70s because they did like Jungle Boogie and Hollywood Swinging. And then by like 1986, they were doing songs like Cherish. And that song sucks. So I just want to put it out there. They had some good stuff in the 80s too, but they also had some real bad crap in the 80s too. So
sure.
For those of you who are music aficionados, I think the Kool and the Gang analogy also works for Dr. J. I just thought of that.
I do feel like Dr. J in this. I do feel like Dr. J in the 70s represents like 70s funk, and then in the 80s he represents more of like the.
It's called urban contemporary music.
Yes, exactly.
It's like Anita Baker.
Right, like that very poppy, like some of that's really good, and really catchy, and really interesting, but it doesn't have like the same. It
ain't got the rawness.
It's very produced, and that is sort of kind of where it takes you from cool to square with Doc is where I guess as much it's as much the times changed than he changed, but It's been interesting to kind of look at that. So thanks, Curtis, for being on the show. Greatly appreciate you being here. And thanks, everyone, for checking us out. You can find us at harborparoxysm.com. You can find us on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We would appreciate a rating and review. That always helps people find out about us and satisfies their egos as well, which, of course, is important. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. Let us know if you're enjoying the basketball mysteries of the 1970s. It's been a lot of work for us. We've had a lot of great guests and a lot of fun discussions, so we appreciate people letting us know if you enjoy it. And until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.